Well, folks, I think all the good things have already been said, so I'm just going to wrap it up here and say, let's go have a bite to eat. So let me just start off by saying good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and friends and allies. If you'd indulge me for a moment, instead of opening with one of my typical bad jokes, I'd like to start with the truth and read some inspirational remarks given recently about the importance of allies. So I'm going to quote something to you. Quote, "Why are we allies? The answer transcends narrow materialism. The animating purpose of our alliance is that we are free societies who put our faith in the rule of law. We believe that when the strong trample the rights and independence of the weak with impunity, then our liberty and our sovereignty are at risk. We believe that when all peoples cannot sail the seas and fly the skies and engage in commerce freely, then our prosperity will suffer. We believe that when the balance of power in the world favors those bent on injustice and aggression and conquest, then the peace that we cherish will not last. That's why we're allies and why we must remain so," unquote. And those words were spoken by Senator John McCain a couple of months ago. He is arguably the American leader on security issues in the Indo-Asia Pacific. So I wanted to start tonight by reflecting on those wise words by Senator McCain, while also sending our thoughts and prayers to him and to Cindy and to their family as they begin his latest battle. Now, while Senator McCain made those remarks in a different place about a different ally, I believe they speak to our alliance with Japan as well. Senator McCain is a great friend of Japan, just like Admiral Mike Mullen, who also introduced me exactly 1 year ago during my speech in Tokyo at RJIF, the Rebuild Japan Initiative Foundation's 2016 event. So thank you, Chairman CNO Admiral Mullen, for yet another overly generous introduction. If there's one thing I've always appreciated, it's creative sincerity. So thank you, sir, very much. Hopefully the media joining us tonight will take Admiral Mullen's kind words to heart as I try to be noteworthy and not newsworthy. Folks, it's great to once again be amongst so many friends from the artists formerly known as the RJIF. Congratulations to Dr. Funabashi and all members of the new Asia-Pacific Initiative, just one of many changes since last year. As strong defenders of the U.S.-Japan alliance, every person here tonight is worthy of recognition. But I'll just take a moment to specifically acknowledge a few, and to begin with Ambassador Mrs. Sasai. Thank you very much for hosting us. What you and the Japanese diplomats here do on a daily basis matters so much to our countries and to the world. To the members of Congress here tonight from both houses and from both sides of the aisle, I think we all agree that our alliance with Japan is truly worthy of bipartisan support. And although he's not with us tonight, I'd like to acknowledge Bill Hagerty, our incoming U.S. ambassador to Japan. I'll be seeing him in Hawaii next month on his way to Japan, and I'm going to do everything I can to support him and the American diplomacy that keeps this alliance strong. We're fortunate to have Admiral Kawano with us tonight. He and I had dinner last night, so candidly, he's probably tired of talking to me. But he gave me a chance to publicly thank him for his critical leadership of our alliance and for his great friendship. Fellow flag and general officers, including our outstanding U.S. Forces Japan Commander General Martinez and Generals Ariki and Iwasaki and Jung and Sharp and Admirals Ruffhead, Blair, and Takei, and to the diplomatic corps here tonight, including former secretaries, assistant secretaries Dave Scheer and Danny Russell and Chip Gregson, and distinguished guests and ladies and gentlemen. I know the only thing that's keeping you from dinner tonight is me, so let me get down to business. As I mentioned, many of you saw me exactly 1 year ago in Tokyo, and a lot has changed in the last 12 months. So during our brief time together tonight, I'll begin by talking about how 3 of those changes have impacted our alliance. 1, last September, North Korea tested yet another nuclear device, and on July 4th of this year, Kim Jong-un successfully launched his first ever intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM. 2, China increased aggressive maneuvers in the East China Sea and continued its unabated militarization of the South China Sea. And 3, in May, we were all reminded that ISIS is a truly global threat, as violent extremist organizations banded together to occupy Marawi City in Mindanao in the Philippines. Now, while all this was going on, the U.S. peacefully transitioned power to a new administration, and one of the first leaders that President Trump spoke with was Prime Minister Abe, the start of what has been a reassuring and productive relationship of both of our countries. We saw Secretary of Defense Mattis visit Japan in February, and Secretary of State Tillerson visit there in March, and Vice President Pence in April, and next month our Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dunford, will visit Japan as well. Indeed, that's a lot of change in just 12 months, but I'll point out 3 truths that have not changed. 1, the Indo-Asia-Pacific remains a top priority for the United States. As Deputy Assistant Secretary Bridge Colby told all of you earlier today, the U.S. remains laser-focused on the region because our interests there are enduring. U.S. key leader engagements with the region, to include Japan, prove our actions back up those words. 2, America is and will remain a Pacific power and Pacific leader. And just as we have for the past 70 years, PACOM joint forces will maintain a robust and stabilizing military presence in the Indo-Asia Pacific. And 3, central to this audience, the strength and necessity of the Japan-U.S. alliance has not changed. In a world crying out for leadership at the global level, the need for our alliance has never been stronger. Today, the ties that bind our countries together have never been more robust. And I submit that those ties have never been more vital because of the mutual threats that we face. During his despotic regime, Kim Jong-un has tested more missiles than his father and grandfather combined, and he's on a record pace to conduct more tests in 2017 than in any other year. In fact, the July 4th ICBM launch by North Korea was its 10th ballistic missile test event this year. Yet another reminder that North Korea is not only the most immediate threat to our alliance, but also a clear and present danger to global peace and stability. Let me emphasize that word, global. As Secretary of State Tillerson rightly said after North Korea's ICBM launch, global action is required to stop a global threat. The alarming behavior exhibited by the Kim Jong-un regime is not just a threat to our friends in South Korea, it's a threat to Japan, it's a threat to China, it's a threat to Russia, it's a threat to U.S. allies in the Philippines, Australia, and Thailand, and it's a threat to the United States. It's a threat to the entire world because North Korea's missiles point in every direction. And it's the reason that we call for all nations to implement far stronger economic sanctions against Pyongyang. Kim Jong-un is on a quest for nuclear weapons on the one hand and the means to deliver them intercontinentally on the other. Separate capabilities where he continues to make substantial progress. As the world saw on July 4th, North Korea now has an intercontinental ballistic missile capability. That means North Korean missiles have the range to reach North America and Hawaii. While I don't know if those missiles can actually hit what they're aimed at, but like horseshoes and hand grenades, getting close is all that's needed when you're dealing with nuclear weapons. Now I want you to stop for a minute and really think about this. Combining nuclear warheads with ballistic missile technology in the hands of Kim Jong-un is a recipe for disaster. And because he isn't afraid to fail in public, North Korean capability will continue to improve. So we must study and consider every possible step to increase the defense of our homelands with the best and most effective solutions possible. Additionally, Japan and South Korea and the United States are vigorously pursuing economic and diplomatic pressures aimed at persuading Pyongyang to give up its nuclear arms program. So at PACOM, we're doing our best to back up these preferred diplomatic options with credible combat power. That's why we deploy carrier strike groups with Aegis ships and the world's best submarines to Northeast Asia. That's why we maintain a formidable continuous bomber presence in the region. And that's why we continue our ironclad defense of Japan, to include deploying our newest and best military platforms like the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, the P-8 Poseidon, and the MV-22 Osprey. And that's why I continue to emphasize multinational collaboration against a North Korean threat that endangers all of our nations. This includes increasing trilateral cooperation with the U.S., Japan, and South Korea, a partnership with a purpose if there ever was one. Our three countries share so much in common: democracy, free markets, a commitment to human rights, and we share common security threats. United, we're stronger, and I believe there is much that we can achieve with close cooperation. I also firmly believe that every nation who considers itself to be a responsible contributor to international security must work diplomatically and economically to bring Kim Jong-un to his senses and not to his knees. That said, my job as a military commander is to develop hard power options for the Secretary of Defense and our President. Many people have talked about military options being unimaginable regarding North Korea. Ladies and gentlemen, I must imagine the unimaginable so that we are always ready to fight tonight. I'll echo Chairman Dunford's recent comments in saying that what is unimaginable is North Korean nuclear-tipped missiles delivered in Denver or in Juneau or in Honolulu or in Seoul or in Tokyo. So I'll continue to provide military options to President Trump and Secretary Mattis while doing everything possible to emphasize our desire for peaceful denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. That includes calling on China to do more to exert its considerable economic influence to stop Pyongyang's unprecedented weapons testing. North Korea has only one ally, and that's China, and vice versa. That means Beijing has exponentially more influence on Pyongyang than anyone else, which makes China the key to a peaceful outcome on the Korean Peninsula. But, ladies and gentlemen, China is not the key for all outcomes. So we continue to find common ground with China about the North Korean threat, even as we criticize China's aggressive behavior elsewhere. For example, some in the press reported this week about an unsafe air intercept by Chinese fighter jets on a U.S. Navy aircraft operating in international airspace. Now, while it's always difficult to ascertain true intent of Chinese pilots, the vast majority of air and sea interactions between the People's Liberation Army and the United States continues to be safe and professional. I want to emphasize that. Most of our interactions with the Chinese military continue to be peaceful, safe, and professional. That's because both of our nations have worked hard to develop military cooperation consultations in an attempt to avoid miscalculations. That said, I remain very concerned about Beijing's increasingly assertive actions that run counter to the international rules-based order. Some might find it odd for me to advocate cooperation with China on the one hand while criticizing Beijing on the other. But as I like to say, great powers can walk and chew gum at the same time. By that, I think we can praise Chinese efforts for help on issues like counter-piracy, even as we rightly hold them accountable for not doing enough to influence their North Korean ally. I think we can and should do both. Accordingly, I'll remind you that the Chinese are building up combat power and positional advantage in an attempt to assert de facto sovereignty over disputed maritime features and spaces in the South China Sea, where they are fundamentally altering the physical and political landscape by creating and militarizing man-made bases and then using tone-deaf propaganda to justify these unprovoked aggressions as measures intended to rescue some wayward fishermen. As I've said before, fake islands should not be believed by real people. Then there's a Japan Defense Ministry report released last April that noted how Japan had to scramble aircraft more than 1,000 times in the East China Sea in the previous 12 months. 1,000 times, mostly because of Chinese incursions into areas rightfully administered by Japan. With these examples in mind, consider that China recently had an intelligence collection ship operating near Alaska in the American Exclusive Economic Zone, or EEZ. China was acting in accordance with international law, so no criticism there. Yet, after this week's unsafe Chinese fighter intercept, I read in the press that they complained about our U.S. aircraft operating in international airspace in the South China Sea in accordance with international law. So as Admiral Scott Swift recently opined, why does China believe that there's a different rule set with respect to the PLA operating in international waters and airspace, while at the same time believing this rule set doesn't apply to other nations operating in international waters and airspace? Ladies and gentlemen, China can't have it both ways. In my opinion, Beijing's desire to pick and choose when it comes to international law demonstrates the kind of nation China is. China is a strategic competitor to the United States and to Japan for that matter. That doesn't mean that conflict is inevitable. I don't believe that Japan or China or the U.S. want that. But because we are in competition, I've advocated dealing with China realistically, as it is and not as we wish it would be. I've repeatedly emphasized that we can't allow the areas where we disagree with China to impact our ability to make progress in the areas where we do agree. All Indo-Asia-Pacific nations, including the United States, should use smart power and try to cooperate with China where possible. For PACOM, my goal remains to convince China that its best future comes from a peaceful cooperation and meaningful participation in the current rules-based international order. But I've also been loud and clear that we want to allow the shared domains to be closed down unilaterally. So we'll cooperate where we can, but remain ready to confront where we must. And now to the third challenge I wanted to mention tonight, and that's ISIS, a clear threat that must be defeated. The main geographic focus of the U.S.-led counter-ISIS coalition has rightfully been in the Middle East and North Africa. But as I've been saying for more than a year now, as our military operations continue to deny ISIS territory, radicalized, weaponized, and displaced terrorists will inspire new fighters in the Indo-Asia Pacific. Sadly, we're seeing some of this come to fruition right now in the southern Philippines, where in 2016, Isnilan Hapilon, a commander of the Abu Sayyaf group, was named the ISIS Emir for Southeast Asia. And now, in just a matter of months, Hapilon started uniting elements